Hello and welcome as this time we come to the 25th Sunday of the year. The readings for this time are first comes from the prophet Amos, chapter 8, verses 4 through 7. The second reading is from the first letter of Paul to Timothy, chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. And the gospel comes from, again, Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Should just mention in passing that because last time we observed a feast in honor of the triumph of the cross, we missed a section, namely chapter 15 of Luke's story, which, by the way, has three of his most famous parables there, all having to do with something which was lost. Namely, lost sheep, lost coins, and then the most famous story, perhaps, of all of the gospel parables, that of the lost son or the prodigal son. So I simply, prodigal father, actually. So I simply mention this in passing. This time we come, when we look at Luke's story, to one of the most discussed parables, one of the most, in a certain way, difficult of parables. I usually don't do this, but I think basically so that you kind of know where we're coming from. It's a parable in which it is pictured that a master discovers that his manager is not doing his job well and wants to let him go. And what the manager then does is call in the debtors of the owner, of the master, has them cancel out part of what they owe him, and sends him away. And the master then says to the manager who has done this that indeed he has been wise and has kind of operated in an interesting way. Now, here are some of the problems that interpreters have with regard to this particular parable. And I will give these questions. We don't have all the answers. I will give a theory that is offered, but there are not universal agreement that this is the way in which this particular parable ought to be looked at. Here are the questions that are proposed by this particular section of Luke's gospel. How can a dishonest steward be praised by his master? So, if he is dishonest, if he's taking advantage of his master, how can he be praised? Who is this master? Some say it's Jesus, or it's a rich man whom the steward calls my master. Is this about lost honor, or is it about lost money? And we will look a little bit at both of those. Honor, of course, is very important, but in this gospel tradition, Luke is always very practical with regard to money. What is the economy presumed in this story? Does it concern usury? In other words, is the steward overcharging those whom he's supposed to be collecting money? And we'll look a little bit at that, because usury, of course, is condemned in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible. What does squandering signify? The master, as we will see, says he's dismissing the manager because he's squandering his resources. But what does squandering mean? Is the charge true or false? Is the guy really squandering, or is it simply an accusation that has been brought against him? Who are the debtors? In other words, why are these people having to pay for the use of the vineyard that they are working. Is the master a sympathetic character, or is he a villain? And so some interpretation of that takes place. Is the steward someone who is to be emulated, or is he a picturesque character designed to give a chuckle in a common story? So some are going to say that this whole thing is kind of a comic story. We'll talk a little bit about that. And another question, where does the original parable end? Because what we're going to see is that there are a number of additions. This would be verses 9, verses 10, verses 11 through 13. Different kind of interpretations added on to this parable. Thus the question, were they originally there, or were they added later on by the writer Luke, and what were the reasons why he did this, and doesn't that affect the way in which the parable is interpreted? Because the sayings that follow in, as I mentioned, 8b through 13, are loosely linked, but perhaps suggest, as some have said, 4 different homilies. And none of them elucidate the real meaning of the opening parable. So all of them, in fact, by listening to these little sections that are added on, what we say, domesticate the parable. In other words, take away from it the dynamism that the parable would have had and the questioning that might be raised about this particular parable. Well, when we give official interpretations, then you take away from the kind of punch that it would have. All right, so all of those are kind of problems of interpretation that are connected here with this parable. In other words, and as I mentioned when it began, what it is that the manager, now this would be a relationship that he has with the owner, and this is based on trust, and this is based, by the way, also on honor. Whatever the manager does needs to bring honor to the owner, not dishonor. All right, and you remember that we started by saying he calls in some of the debts that are done. How much do you owe? Okay, sit down and write this. Okay, how much do you owe? All right, sit down and write this. So what he does is, it looks like he reduces what is owed to the owner. Now, wait a minute. Is he cheating the owner? After all, the owner is due, say, the 100. Now it's reduced by half. Who is benefiting by this? So you see, these are, if he's a dishonest servant, is Jesus really praising dishonesty? Is this the whole point of it? So you see, this raises very interesting concerns if one doesn't look perhaps a little bit below the surface here. All right, now the people who are in debt, and we presume they are debtors, that is, they owe, or are they simply renting a part of the field owned by the master, and therefore there could be, as we look at it, 3 kinds of renters. One would pay a percentage of whatever the crop was to the owner. Another would be, there was a fixed amount of money that was to be paid each year, and that's the way in which the debt was paid. Or did they pay rent in money? So rather than give a crop, as we heard, they gave the owner money. So we're not sure, and which kind of renters we're using here. The general understanding is that it would probably be the second kind, payment that is fixed each year. All right. Now, what happens is the manager is being let go. We don't know why he's let go. Nobody tells us what he has done. He has squandered his master's goods. What does exactly squander mean? Now, I know you probably have a dictionary there, and you can check that and see what that is, but we really don't know what he means here when he says that he squanders the goods of his master. Now, a popular theory here is, and this is one that I think you probably have heard and would suggest here, is that the way in which this deal worked was that the master gave to the manager a bill at the beginning of the harvest, if you want, in which it was said how much he owed him. And therefore, the manager had to pay. Now, this would change things, wouldn't it? He had to pay that money ahead of time to the manager, to the owner. If this were so, it wouldn't matter what he did, would it? But if it worked another way, that he only paid it after he got the money from the various different renters, then it would go in a different way. Now, here's the theory. Dishonest. In other words, he's taking advantage, that's how this theory would go, of the master by cheating him. He deserves, you have 100, cut it down to 50. He's cheating him out of the 50. This makes him dishonest, and that's where many interpretations used to be and still are, a dishonest manager. And why? Well, because the manager, the owner says, now the manager is kind of prudent, kind of clever. What he praises, now it may be a little dishonest, but what he praises is the cleverness of the manager. He finds a way to save, if you want, his skill, because as he said, when I cut what they owe, when I am let go, then I will be able to, kind of what we often say, you give something, you now have a chip that you call render. So when I'm let go, I'll go to these people and whom I have helped here, and they probably would be obliged to honor me. All right, now that's one way to say that he was dishonest. Another way of interpretation is this, that the manager knew how much he owed to the master at the end of the harvest time. So what he would do when he developed that bill that was given to each of the renters was this. He would add his own income to the bill that he gave to the renter. So just hypothetically, say that the master said, I expect 80 say bushels here, okay? All right, now that's what the master would expect. So what I would do if I were the manager is that before I gave the bill to the renter, I would add 15. So I would say to the renter, you owe me 95. See, so the master gets 80. Now this guy gets 15%, or 15 pennies, whatever you want, and gives the ultimate bill to the renter. Now, he then calls in the renter when he loses his job, or is going to lose his job, and says, look, here's how much and I'm just hypothetically creating this a little bit, so it's a little different than what the parable says. How much do you owe? Well, he says 95. All right, he says, sit down and write 80. All right? Now, what he has done, and this is what some interpret this parable as saying, what he has done is cut out his own profit. See? So in that sense, he is not cheating the owner. He is giving the owner what the owner had asked. What he is sacrificing, if you want, or giving up for his own sake is his money. Now, the guy who got the bill, the 95, he doesn't know that. So in some ways, and here's how this would work, when the master hears what has gone on, the renters are all saying, gee, the master was pretty nice this year. He's a pretty good guy. So if the master were to say, wait a minute, the manager has kind of acted inappropriately here, he would lose the good graces that he had achieved in the eyes of the renters. So see, in that sense, the manager has preserved the honor of the master, has made him look good in the eyes of the renters, and he in a certain way puts the master in a position where he really can't say too much more, okay? Unless he wants to lose the good graces that he has received from the action as they perceived it. Now keep in mind that the manager here, and what we're talking about are agricultural items, okay? And usually what the renters owed to the master would be things that would be grown. So we're not talking about bank accounts or anything like that. And things like olive oil or wheat would have been some of the ideas, and that's why the parable speaks in those terms, very much representing the kind of economic system that was pretty ordinary for most people who lived in this time. After all, we're living here in a pre-industrial world, and where agriculture is the heart of the economy. And so whoever controls the land and the agricultural production had the power to exact whatever surplus there might be. So I kind of fudged this a little bit into the whole kind of economic system that is at work here. One might say that the steward who uses this window of opportunity to save his own position by not, now, was this what had happened? That's one of the interpretations that has occurred here. As I said in some of the opening questions here, when the manager is accused of squandering, what exactly does that mean? So again, you could kind of develop a whole little homily or thought about what squandering is. And he is interesting here. The owner is pictured as, well, calling the manager to him. Now, does he go to where the manager is, the owner, or does the manager go to the owner? Parable suggests that the owner came where the manager was. Now that's interesting. So all of this is kind of leads to what I'm saying here is, leads to the difficulty of finding one exact issue to be looked at here. Here are, and what is one of the concerns here is, where exactly does this parable end? Now, the common thought is that it ends in verse 8a, and that verse 8b picks up the beginning of interpretation. The master is called, and the Greek here is used, kairos, K-Y-R-O-S. And the master praises the wicked manager because he acted, and this is one of the ways of interpreting this, cleverly. Does this end the parable in the voice of Jesus, or does it begin the interpretation that is put in the mouth of Jesus by the narrator? So you see the difficulty in verse 8 here is what is said in that whole verse really what Jesus said, or is this, as I mentioned, what has been put into his mouth by, namely, the gospel writer Luke? All right. What is the nature of the household manager's action? Is he, now if all of this he's to be kind of praised, encouraged to continue his fraudulent ways for his own advantage, and to continue cheating his master if he is doing something wrong? Or did he sacrifice to secure grateful clients for himself? And that would be a kind of another thought here. Therefore, make friends. And the verse 9 here talks about with the mammon of wickedness, where the little saying says that those who are of the world are more clever than those who are children of the light. Is this therefore saying that children of the light should do what children of the world should do? Yeah? You don't know. And I think there's another little thought here too. Do you use money to make friends? Now, isn't that interesting? Because how often, of course, many stories and novels that are developed, that's the very idea. If you want to, well, I'm not sure it's always friends, but if you want to get what you want done and you don't want to do it, you give the money to the person who will do it. There is an agreement. Is this a friendly relationship? Well, I don't know, but nevertheless. So this takes us back to a point that we think very often with regard to Luke, that he's very practical in the things that he does. Another question, and what I'm just kind of suggesting this time, is that there are a number of reasons why interpretation of this particular parable is so difficult. Is the manager practicing usury? Now, usury, as you remember, is condemned by in the Old Testament. Here are places where you can find this. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, verses 7 through 8, verses 23, chapter 23, verses 20 through 21. In the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verses 24. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verses 36 through 37. Now, I know you're going to run and check all those out, but my point here is that usury is condemned, and these books, by the way, the three that I've quoted, are all part of what is known as the Pentateuch, which is the Torah, is condemned. Therefore, if he is practicing usury, no matter how you might like to color this, then he certainly is violating the tradition and is wrong. Now, another interpretation of this whole parable is that this is a comic kind of thing. Why? Because in looking at the literature of the time, particularly among some of the popular philosophers, there are stories about a comic rogue. And the way in which this rogue survives is by wits that he uses in difficult situations. He takes he acts very cleverly, and he gets the better of his master. And of course, everybody likes these kind of stories, don't we? Where the little guy gets the big guy and he falls. And we kind of like those comic stories. So that's another interpretation. So there's still much more in trying to determine exactly what was the original sense of this parable as attributed to Jesus. I did want to just conclude by giving some quick thoughts about the first reading, which is due to the prophet Amos, where Amos here is pictured, and this might be why this reading is chosen, because in some ways it might supplement one interpretation of the gospel parable. This is Amos the prophet, denounces unscrupulous merchants for their false piety, for their avarice, for their dishonest business practices, for their exploitation of the poor and the defenseless. So Amos is one of the most outspoken and direct prophets for arguing social justice. And what he is saying, as we will hear if you listen carefully to the reading this time, that on the Sabbath, or on the holy days, with the great holidays, what these men do is sit and not pray, but devise ways in which they can take advantage of others. So they don't celebrate rightly, but use this as an opportunity to devise more clever plans to make money. How do they, and therefore oppose the poor. So what do they do? Well, for example, they think of how they can make the scale that they use when it goes to kind of help or hinder, how they can balance it in their favor. So for example, they use a shekel. A shekel equals 1 ounce, but a loaded shekel, they can make them a little heavier or a little less, depending on how they want to, when they kind of work the scale, take advantage of particularly the poor. He really, in the little section that we have, to use, as I mentioned, Amos says shekels as a measure. There's no way to know, and shekels, by the way, were of different weight, okay? Unlike your penny or your $50, they weigh exactly the same as the mint produces it. That wasn't the way then. These shekels could weigh a lot, now 4 ounce, over or under that. And these guys knew how to use the light one so that they could get more from the poor and not be so helpful. So what Amos is decrying are merchants' dishonesty, the way in which they take advantage of the poor. And this, of course, is the message of Amos and also of some of the other prophets. Do not take advantage of the poor, because if you do, know that God means never to forget the greedy assault on the poor. And it's interesting what he says the Lord will use to get back at those who do this are natural phenomena, earthquakes, an eclipse, a famine, and deprivation of other kinds. Now I know we got to be very careful here that we do not think of the Lord as using nature as a way of getting back. But that's one of the ways in which Amos here says will happen, because if you take advantage, says Amos, of the poor, if you mistreat and don't operate fairly, God will not forget. And now whether or not that works to bring the merchants around and to stop what the practice they were doing, we will never know. All right, so this time, once again, an interesting parable, has to do with honor. Merchant, the manager preserves the honor of the master. Money, who makes the profit and who benefits by this money. And again, maybe the commonality of both these readings is how are the poor dealt with. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.